alone in the dark. Rocky walls all around in a cramped space. Yet you hear something skittering around. Something large but agile. It moves with ease through the cavern. And when you feel it yank at your legs, you never see your own demise. Today I've got some terrifying stories that take place in caves. Enjoy, and send me your true scary stories at darkstories.org so I can narrate them. And check out all my podcasts at eeriecast.com. Now, let's begin. The Cave in the Mountain, from SkippMcGrippIII. Being the youngest of 3 to Mexican-American parents, I traveled to Mexico at least twice a year. A long 4-week visit during the summers and 1 or more shorter vacations during the winter break, or throughout the year. My folks both come from a small village in the desert valley in central Mexico. During my childhood and adolescence, the village or town, whatever you'd like to call it, had at maximum 300 residents. Everybody knew everybody. You get it. As a child going from the downtown of a major Texas city to the lawless deserts of Mexico was liberating in a way. I could do whatever I wanted at any time with little apparent consequence. I discovered a lot about myself and learned to respect life and nature while hunting and working in the hills of Mexico. A popular pastime for the folks of the town was to hike up the mountain that the town was at the foot of. Once at the top, which took a whole day to reach, you could enjoy a view of the entire town and the valley while the sun set. It was a truly enjoyable experience. One evening while at the top of the mountain, my good friend who lived in the village, who would spend every day with me while I visited, told me about a giant cave on the far side of the mountain. "I've never been on that side of the mountain. There's a cave back there?" I asked. I thought it was strange that, during all those years of visiting, nobody had ever mentioned a cave on the far side of the mountain I'd been on so many times. "Let's go," he said, not waiting for me to respond. He got up from the giant boulder we were sitting on and started up over the peak of the mount. I followed right behind him. He had gotten me into some trouble before, but I'd never really gotten hurt because of him, so why not, I thought. There are no trails or markers on the mountain, so finding the mouth of the cave was a little difficult for him. After a while of looking, we found it though. It was indeed a giant hole carved down into the mountain, going down as far as I could see. The light from the setting sun didn't light up more than a few yards down, until it turned into pure darkness. We stood at the edge, peeking down into the depths of the cave. Almost instantly, my eyes and nose began to burn so intensely, like I'd never felt before. The smell of ammonia from the bats that lived in the cave hit me unexpectedly. Meanwhile, my bud was having himself a good laugh at the expense of my tear ducts and nose hairs. We stared down into the giant hole for a good minute, looking around at all the bats and rock formations. I pointed at some beams of wood, or really long tree trunks that were placed across the cave at varying depths. "What are those for?" I asked. "Farmers hire people to climb down there and bag bat poop to use as fertilizer. They make a lot of money. Want to take some?" he asked excitedly. I declined, not wanting to go into the cave at all. But as I already expected, my friend began to climb his way down. He made his way down to the first section of the cave that had sufficient level ground to stand on without the aid of the wooden beams. He yelled at me to follow him, and I don't quite remember how, but he convinced me to climb down into the cave. The beams were pretty far apart from each other, since they were placed by and intended for adults. I must have been around 10 years old at the time. We both stood on the small section of level ground, trying not to breathe, as the smell was burning our lungs. "Come on," he said. He then continued on to the next beam underneath us. "I'm not going down there, man," I said back to him, nervously. He didn't stop, though. I know he heard me, and maybe he figured I would be right behind him, but he kept going until I couldn't see him through the darkness of the cave. I could hear him whistle at me from different positions inside the cave, and eventually I didn't hear him at all. He had either stopped whistling entirely, or he went so deep into the cave that I couldn't hear him anymore. He had mentioned that once it got to a certain depth, the floor evened out and you could easily walk deeper into the cave. Bats were starting to fly out in swarms. I knew they wouldn't purposefully hurt me, but they were very loud and distracting. I had to really focus hard on not losing my footing and falling into the cave. Once most of them passed, and I was sure I could be heard if I yelled into the cave, I called out to my bud, Hey, let's go before it gets dark." I stood there waiting for a reply, but he never called back to me. I looked around, debating whether I should stay put or climb out and wait for him outside the cave. I noticed a few empty rice bags, which I assumed were used for carrying the bat poop, tucked into the spaces between the rocks and the walls of the cave. I also noticed what looked to be clothes snagged on the edges of the rocks and the walls lower into the caves. Shoes were left on the small ledges that naturally occurred in the cave. Odd, I thought, thinking some folks found it easier to climb while barefoot. Then I heard huffing coming from beneath me. It was the unmistakable sound of someone in a panic. I tried my hardest to see down into the dark, but at this point it was no use. My friend would frequently play tricks on me, so I hesitated to believe that he was actually in some kind of trouble, rushing up to the top of the cave. I could hear the distress in his voice, though, as he got closer. When he came into view, he had a look that I initially misunderstood as anger, as if he were unhappy that I hadn't followed him down. However, as he climbed higher up the wooden beams towards me, I saw the look of fear on his face. He didn't stop to let me up first. He passed me up in a hurry and was out of that cave before I even made a move. I looked down once more at the darkness beneath me and saw nothing, heard nothing. I focused on balancing on the logs and beams until I made it out of the cave. Once I was out, I looked around for my friend so we could leave, but I didn't see him anywhere near the mouth of the cave. I yelled out, calling for him, getting ready to accept the fact that he had probably left me behind once again and was halfway down the mountain by then. I called him one more time, scanning around for him, and found him at the tree line sitting next to a big rock. "Hey, man, let's go before it gets dark," I said as I walked toward him. I was so relieved I wouldn't have to find my way down the mountain on my own in the dark. He just sat there looking kind of confused. I was trying to figure out what he was thinking or why he was behaving so weird. He started breathing heavier and heavier with each breath, and anger began to settle into his face. I backed away, knowing what he was capable of doing in his rage. He was a good guy who wouldn't hurt me or anyone without being truly deserving of a beating, but while in a blind rage he had once knocked his brother unconscious who just happened to be in the line of fire. I wasn't in the mood to get floored. He got up from the dirt and walked toward the mouth of the cave, stopping to pick up a giant rock, a mini boulder actually, really smashing his thumb in the process, which only fueled his anger more. With the rock in his arms, he walked to the opening, lifted it up, and sent it crashing down into the dark hole in the earth. The rock broke through some of the wooden beams on its way down and caused an enormous roar of echoes that filled the air around us. The sound didn't seem to stop, but when it finally did quiet down, my friend looked like he was getting nervous. He gave me a look and nodded toward the trees, telling me it was time to go. Whenever we would hike up the mountain, it was kind of a tradition to run down the mountain at full speed, jumping from the edges of the protruding boulders from the face of the mountain. Our landings were softened by the decades of dirt and dead leaves piled up on the steep face of the mountain. Dangerous, yes, but most of the activities we filled our days with were dangerous. We were just kids with only our imaginations to entertain ourselves. So when we started jumping and hopping down the mountain, my friend was covering way more ground than I was. I tried my best to keep up with him, but he left me behind, seemingly without even trying. He would stop every now and then to let me catch up though. We made it back to town in about 40 minutes. We sat in my family's living room for a while, which is no more than an open-air concrete corridor with a roof made of bamboo and clay shingles. He held his hand up and showed me his thumb. It was a disgusting purple swollen lump. "I need to drain the blood," he said as he blankly stared at his hand. I found him a sewing needle and held it over a candle for a few seconds. I slowly pierced the skin of his thumb with the needle, and I could see it hurt him quite a bit. He was really quiet after that. Maybe it was that we turned into teenagers soon after, but every year I visited after that, he was never the guy I knew as a kid. Last summer in 2020, I got news that my good friend was found in his house, hanging in his room. I had no doubt that he had enemies in town and in the surrounding villages that might have something to do with his death. However, his wife said she was sure he had hung himself. He was there with me when I went on my first hunt, when I harvested my first beehive, when I unknowingly stole a herd of cattle from the drug lord in our region, when we got lost in the desert and jumped into a well just to drink water, when my aunt unloaded her rifle on us when she thought we were trespassers, and when we were chased by a herd of bulls that got away from their rancher. I often wonder what happened in that cave that really changed him. I truly regret not being in there with him that day. The Blue Hole, from Hannah. This isn't my story, but the story of a coworker of mine. I'm stationed in the military on the island of Guam, and there isn't much to do here, except drink on the beach, go to the bars, or get scuba certified. My coworker, Eliza, we'll call her, had gotten her diving certification when she first got here, and had some wacky and scary stories from beneath the waves. She's told me quite a few, but this one is probably my favorite. This happened about a year ago as of writing this. Outside of the mouth of the largest harbor on the island is a place called the Blue Hole. This is a notorious place for divers because there have been several deaths in the past few years. One woman got separated from her diving partner and ended up swimming up too fast. She got the bends, got confused, started swimming down until she got trapped in a cave. This was the most recent death, but plenty of people have been rushed to the hyperbolic chamber. A lot of the locals say that the Blue Hole is actually the mouth of a demon who climbed out of Mariana's Trench when the world was first formed. I digress. Eliza and her husband decided they were going to do the Blue Hole and quickly donned their scuba gear and jumped right in. The water was an incredible cobalt blue, with rays of the sun bouncing off of the coral like diamonds. Her husband motioned Eliza to go down into the hole with him. The two of them began their descent into the darkness of the hole. It goes down about 300 feet, but unless you're specially trained, you can't go that deep. The sides are riddled with subterranean aqueducts that go everywhere under the island. Nobody has ever explored them all. The deeper they go, the darker it gets, with sharks and fish swimming around them lazily. The water begins to get icy cold, and Eliza shivered in her wetsuit top. Eliza starts to dive deeper. She's certified as a deep-sea diver but has not done this dive before. Mistake number 1. She continued to dive deeper and deeper, swimming towards the caves. A warm current is being emitted in a strong stream from a random cavern that she shines her light into. It goes on for about 20 feet, then takes a sharp right. No harm in just swimming down to check it out. Eliza continues on her way down the tunnel, but hasn't accounted for the change in currents in the cave. There are 2 pathways, she now realizes with horror, and the current is pushing her down the right one. Terrified, with her heart beating wildly, Eliza tried to fight against the current, but to no avail. She couldn't have had more than 10 minutes left of oxygen. Alone and scared, she is pushed by the currents to and fro. She can't go back the way she came because of the strength of the water, but to forge on ahead would be suicide. Struggling against the tides, she saw a cave up in front of her, and to her relief, she could see a light from the mouth of the cave. Gripping the volcanic rock, she pulled herself free of the current and swam towards the light. Thankfully, this cave just seemed to loop around, and waiting for her on the other side was her husband. The 2 had to go slow as they reached the top because of the bends, but when they made it, Eliza vowed never to go searching in caves ever again. And to this day, she's kept her promise. She's now a diving instructor, and I recently got my certification from her. She uses this story as a valuable lesson. Do not go into undersea caves alone. Creepy Zoo Encounter. From Anonymous. My family and I decided to take a trip to the zoo one day, but instead of a nice day out with the family, it turned into a horrifying memory for me. My family consists of 2 nephews, my sister, my mom, and dad. The beginning of the day turned out to be just fine, fun-filled and animal feeding galore. The latter half of the day was when adult activities would take place, like major heights ziplining, drinking, and kayaking. So my mom and dad were going to try the ziplining. My sister was meeting up with one of my mom's friends they saw at the zoo with her fiancé, and I was stuck with the youngest of my nephews, the 3-year-old. No biggie, he was easy to handle, one of the most well-mannered 3-year-olds I've ever met. So we went to the playground. Now, this playground was a mock-up cave-type thing, and had a top, inside, and underground section. A lot of places for kids to hide. My nephew, however, was scared of the dark, so he wouldn't go in the cave without me. But I was recovering from surgery at the time, so walking was okay, but crouching and stairs were agony. I told him I couldn't, and he gave me a pout, but went to play anyway. He walked around the outside and played with other playground things like a sitting spin, tiny stepping stones elevated higher and higher off the ground, etc. Eventually, he was walking around the cave system, a giant circle, over and over again. He would be out of my sight until he came back around. After the 10th time of him doing this, I checked my phone to see the time and notifications. Scrolling through my Instagram likes of my pics of the zoo took about 2 minutes. Then I looked back up, because I had a strange feeling of dread. I still, to this day, don't know what made me feel that way. I kept my head up, waiting for my nephew to come around from his endless looping circle, but he didn't. I didn't hesitate to get up and walk around, but I didn't see him, and panic set in. I called for him in that cave system, pleading him to just tell me he's in there, but there was nothing. I walked around again, still nothing. Now, the playground didn't have any barriers, besides a tiny wooden fence no more than 10 inches off the ground with fake trees and vines hanging. Immediately, I got teed off. The playground was right in front of the freaking exit, for Christ's sake. It's a pedo's dream. Walk in, snatch a kid, and leave. My nephew was a very white kid. His hair was so blonde it was white, and that day he had a white shirt on, so he was practically glowing in the sunlight. That's the only way I saw him through the decorations of vines. I stepped over the fence and through the vines to the side. Now, just that little motion, I could feel my surgery area twinge a little. But I didn't care, because my 3-year-old nephew at the moment was holding hands and walking away with a man I didn't know. It wasn't his father. It's sad, but his father was in circles of care, and the build was all wrong. He was shorter and a bit more stocky than his dad. He had a black t-shirt and a dirty white hat, sunglasses too. I ran toward them. I screamed my nephew's name. He turned around, but the man did not. I still remember the confused little look on his face. Looking back at it now, it was heartbreaking. I screamed then, "That man is kidnapping my nephew!" at the top of my lungs. That of course got his attention. That freaking prick started running, and he actually toppled over my nephew fleeing towards the gift shop exit. The one not monitored by security guards, I found out later, ironically enough. My nephew was on the ground in a daze. Just having a full-grown man's knee hit your head tends to do that. I flung myself on the ground, not caring about the pain of my abdomen. I hugged him the tightest I'd ever hugged him. People began to crowd around, and a few guys went after the kidnapper. But he got away. It eats at me every day knowing that this psycho almost got away with luring a child. After confronting my nephew later that week, the man said, he was going to get all the kids hot dogs, but he wanted to know what him, my nephew, wanted on his. My nephew is fine, just a bit shaken up, with a skinned knee, and I ended up messing up my stitches. I'm much better now, though. Thanks for listening. The White Face from MCW. I should have known better. I had every sign waving right in front of my face. I had every opportunity to back out and say nope, but I didn't. I've only got myself to blame. This all centers around my friend, who, for the purpose of this story, we'll call Stephanie. Stephanie was bold. We both came from poor, struggling families and were bullied pretty heavily for being the weird kids. I think we bonded over our shared misery. Despite that, Stephanie always stood up for herself. She was loud. She let everyone know exactly what she thought of them, and she wasn't afraid to hurt someone's feelings. I was much the opposite. I lived in a shell, timidly stepping around others and navigating social scenes with trepidation. We coped with the torment in different ways. While our friendship was short, we were extremely close. I was always at her apartment. Her family loved me, and I always felt incredibly welcomed there. They were the busy type, constantly working, leaving Stephanie and I to fend for ourselves most of the time, though we didn't mind. Her apartment, on the other hand, was not so welcoming. From the beginning, I knew something was off. The first incident was the boxes. Stephanie and I went downstairs to get something to eat, only to find a strange reassortment of some boxes that were on the counter. It sounds ridiculous, but 3 boxes sat lined up in front of the microwave, spaced evenly apart. We gave each other a skeptical look. Were these here before?" she asked. "I don't remember them being like that, but it could have been your family unloading groceries or something," I responded. We shrugged it off, got something to eat, and went back upstairs. Soon the bruises came. It seemed like every day Stephanie would have a new bruise pop up. I was worried at first that it could be her family harming her, but she insisted she had no idea where they came from. I know her family very well, and I don't think they would ever do something like that. She was not the clumsy type either, and didn't do any sports, so we truly had no clue as to why she had them. I mentioned before that Stephanie lived in an apartment. She lived there with her mother and stepfather. The voices are what we noticed next. When nobody was home, we could have swore we heard voices coming from downstairs. Because it was an apartment, We tried to blame it on her neighbors. There were no neighbors on one side, and on the other side lived a sweet old woman who we'll call Gladys. I don't know if I ever heard her voice coming through any of the walls. She had a soft, rumbly, very distinct voice. The whispers and conversations we heard did not sound anything like Gladys. But because of the situation, it was impossible to be sure. Stephanie had me come over after school one day. She hadn't seemed like her normal self. She was moody and irritable. I was anxious to know what was wrong, and we hurriedly walked to her apartment. When we got to her room, she immediately pulled up her shirt and showed me her back. Against her porcelain skin sat 3 angry red scratches. They looked as though something had slowly scraped its claws across her back. My eyes widened, and we stared at one another. I looked with shock. Stephanie looked with fear. "How did you get those?" I asked, as if it wasn't obvious that we had no idea. Her eyes glimmered with tears. "I don't know, but they hurt," she said. "Do you want me to put anything on them to help?" I inquired. She shook her head, lowered her shirt, and for the first time, we discussed the weird crap that had been going on. We never thought we'd be the stars of the most cliché horror movie ever, but there we were. Stephanie then confided in me that her mom was a bit of a religious nut. I knew she identified as a Christian, but until then I didn't understand the extent of how deep it ran. She told me that when they first moved into the apartment, that her mom went around with holy water and drew crosses over each bed and doorway. Additionally, she had placed a small crucifix over each bed. Warning bells began ringing in my head, but unfortunately, we were powerless. It's horrible to feel so defeated, like you have no control over your own life. I felt so bad for Stephanie, who this was actually affecting. It all came to a head one afternoon. Stephanie and I decided to go hiking the local mountain called the Pinnacles. The Pinnacles has 3 trails: the East, the West, and Indian Fort Trail. The East is mostly flat, but it's the longest. It's the easiest trail to take, and is the most traveled. The majority of the landmarks are along this trail. The West is the next most traveled, but it's steeper, making it more difficult to hike. It's the second longest trail. The Indian Fort Trail almost feels like rock climbing because it's so steep, but it's very short. Stephanie and I decided to take the East, as both of us were on the larger side, and hiking the other trails was harder for us. The Pinnacles closes its gates when night falls. I should have mentioned earlier that this all took place during the spring of 2016. Dusk came around 7:30 p.m., and it was completely dark by 8. We started the hike at 3:30 p.m. Unsurprisingly, we were slow. It took us half an hour just to get to the part of the trail where it splits. The sun was still high in the sky, and foolishly we felt safe. Not soon after, we took the East Trail. A hazy fog fell low to the ground. The sun became blocked by clouds that were rapidly closing in. A sort of static hung in the air, and a feeling of claustrophobia settled deep into my bones. I caught Stephanie's eye in a side glance, but she said nothing. We continued, despite the fast-changing weather conditions. After hiking the East Trail for about an hour, rain began to fall. There were 2 landmarks with overhangs where we could seek shelter while we waited it out. One was called the Eagle's Nest, the other the Devil's Kitchen. I knew the East Trail like the back of my hand, and from our vantage point, we were roughly equidistant between the 2. The Devil's Kitchen is essentially a shallow cave, so we decided to head there as it had more coverage. By the time we got there, we were soaked. The rain came harder and harder, with seemingly no end. I couldn't tell you how long we waited. At one point, I pulled out my phone to check the time, only to find it had died. I found that extremely odd, as I had a fully charged battery when I left, and only used it to take pictures along the way. Stephanie's phone had died too. Technology is weird though, and anything could make it malfunction. Nevertheless, we were cold, shivering, alone in the devil's kitchen, while the rain just kept coming. It wasn't long before Stephanie and I heard branches breaking. We couldn't be sure that that's what we were hearing over the roar of the rain, but as the sound became louder and closer, we were positive that's what it was. We looked at each other and didn't speak. The tension was palpable. Our eyes conveyed the same thing, terror. Once again, we were helpless. Out of the haze, a silhouette appeared and began to take form. A sort of shadow. I'd guess it stood about 8 feet tall. I looked at Stephanie again and saw that she had her eyes closed. I wondered if she had seen the figure. Panic bubbled in my stomach, an icy lump that sunk into my gut. My breath came in rapid bursts as I watched the figure become clearer. What could I do? Stephanie and I were backed into a corner, and there was a stranger coming towards us, a stranger that stood unnaturally tall and emanated a frightening aura. I let out a whimper. What was the sense in being quiet when it clearly knew where we were? There was no hiding. There was no running. I followed Stephanie and closed my eyes, not knowing what else to do. Maybe when I opened them, the thing would be gone. Fear flooded my brain. My heart pounded, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. After maybe 5 minutes, I decided that I would open my eyes. Slowly, with tears welling up, I opened them, and I screamed. Directly in front of my face was another one, staring back at me. It was white as a sheet with empty black pits for eyes. It had no nose and a small tear where I think its mouth should have been. The thing made no noise, no indication that it had moved at all, despite the fact that we heard branches breaking that we thought signaled its approach. Gnarled, bony fingers with nails like ice picks reached towards my face, and a shaky, rattling breath escaped its mouth. I bolted. Stephanie was right behind me. I made a sort of thrusting and kicking motion as I moved forward, but didn't connect with the body or anything for that matter. When we made it to the entrance of the cave, I made the cardinal error of looking back. But there was nothing. Regardless, we ran. We weren't very fast, but we kept going. We didn't stop until we reached the end of the trail where the split is. Stephanie and I panted, taking deep, desperate breaths. We walked the rest of the way until we made it to her car. Thank God we weren't any later. Dusk had begun to fall, and soon it would be dark. I went with her back to her apartment and made the decision to stay the night. Nobody was home when we arrived. We went straight upstairs, changed our clothes, took turns showering, and went to sleep, utterly exhausted. At some point during the night, my eyes opened. I was sleeping on a mattress on the floor that Stephanie always drug in for me. I checked my phone that I'd put on the charger and saw that it was 2 a.m. I was wondering what awakened me when I heard it, the door creaking ever so slightly open. I strained my eyes to try to see through the widening crack. I didn't have my glasses on, and my vision is terrible, so it was hard. The door continued to widen, and eventually I saw it. The face. Its body was the blackest black I've ever seen, so much so that it was outlined against the faint glow of moonlight beaming in through the curtains. My stomach dropped, and that all too familiar feeling of panic rose into my throat. My eyes darted around the room, catching on a glint of gold illuminated by the moonlight. The crucifix. It was, and I kid you not, upside down. I almost soiled myself out of fear. My eyes shot back to the thing, but it had vanished. I let out a rough, gravelly breath. What was this thing? Why was it following us? I looked over to Stephanie, only to see that her eyes were wide open. She had seen it too. As per usual, we said nothing, only staring on in horror. The next morning, I gathered my things and left. We didn't talk about what had happened or what we saw. Our friendship ended soon after the incident for unrelated reasons, but it seems a cloud had hung over me since then. While I've never seen that face again, I can never hold a friendship or relationship. Everything I love disintegrates right in front of my eyes. I'm watching my life fall apart, and I can't help but think this thing has been following me all these years. I don't know how Stephanie is doing, or how she may be plagued by the white face. It's been almost 4 years since this happened, and I still have nightmares, and I think about it every single day. I shouldn't have ignored all the warnings. The boxes, the voices, the bruises, the scratches. Stephanie and I should have taken action to prevent something like that from happening. My downfall has been no one's fault but my own.